Welcome to a virtual tour of the exhibition Forming the Maslow Collection, a reflection on the New York City art scene in the 1980s and 90s, currently on view at the Everhart Museum in Scranton. My name is Ryan Ward. I'm the curator of the Maslow Collection. This exhibition was co-curated by myself and the curator of the Everhart Museum, Francesco Clemente. What we did was break the selection of artworks into 4 different categories or genres throughout 4 exhibition rooms in the wing of the Everhart Museum. When we enter, we come to the title page here. And what we really wanted to discuss and emphasize with this exhibition was New York City itself in and around these 2 decades. What the activity was, who the practicing artists were, how the Maslow family got to know these artists and the dealers that represented them, and give a picture of the vast array of artistic approaches and studio practices happening at this time. The first room deals with abstraction, and you can see that there are many forms of abstraction happening at this time. Anything from gestural, lyrical abstraction to geometric, dealing with a whole host of source material. What we have here next to the title is a large gestural oil on canvas by Mare, who's a very important artist to the Maslow Collection and to the family. She's somebody that they got to know very personally, and who is represented by around maybe 20 works in the collection. And that's something worth noting, is that not only does the Maslow Collection have a large amount of modern and contemporary work, about close to 600 pieces, 150 different artists are represented in the collection. So it has this real breadth to it, but this depth as well, because many of the artists are represented by 10 or more artworks. To the right is a geometric, almost target piece by Gary Lang, and to the right of that is very interesting large-scale oil and canvas by Catherine Porter, and she's somebody that's very hard to categorize because of how diverse her sets of sources really are. This shaped wood panel is by Anthony Source, who was the first advisor or consultant to the Maslow family in forming the collection. A very prolific artist himself. He's somebody who became quick friends with the Maslow family, and he's the person that would do the research, the legwork in New York City, and he would say, here's the circuit that we'd like to accomplish this month. And they would tour around and they would narrow in on artists and works that resonated with them, and they would purchase those works. So Tony is an instrumental figure in the whole scheme of forming the Maslow Collection. As we progress around the galleries, we come to dealing with Neo-Expressionism, and we see some well-known artists. On the right is Francesco Clemente with a self-portrait, very interesting piece. It appears to be a watercolor, but in reality is actually a ukiyo-e print, a Japanese woodblock print, done with multiple colors, a very labor-intensive process, but has a real impact and is incredibly impressive in and of itself in terms of its process. To the left of that is Lois Lane with a figurative collage piece. Then we have Sandra Chia, another Italian artist, in addition to Francesco Clemente. The title of that one is Two Boys in a Raft. It's an etching. And to the left of that is Jennifer Bartlett with a series of screen prints done around a scene of a swimming pool and a sculpture. Here on the right, we have a woodblock print by Susan Rothenberg. For a while in the 80s, she dealt with the motif of puppets or bones. So that's where some of this imagery is coming from in that woodblock. And here on the left we have an etching by Julian Schnabel, who would be the artist that's most closely associated with the Neo-Expressionist movement of this time. Then he moved on to also become a filmmaker and has made very successful films such as Basquiat and Diving Bell and the Butterfly, and more recently At Eternity's Gate, the film on Vincent van Gogh. Here we have a David Sally etching on the right, multiple figures overlaid in one image, and Jane Hammond on the left with a collage / printmaking piece using imagery lifted from catalogs. So now we enter into the pop art area with a lot of crowd pleasers, a lot of favorites herein. And on the left we have Robert Rauschenberg with a piece called Hot Shot, and it's dealing with, of course, events in the 1960s and 70s. On the right is Roy Lichtenstein, very recognizable. He's someone that used popular imagery, of course, which is where the term comes from, pop art. And he had a very narrow focus in comparison to even someone like Andy Warhol, whereas he used comic strips mainly throughout his career, and he cropped them in different ways, spliced them together, and highlighted the pixelized nature of them. Here is Jasper Johns with his series The Seasons. This series is important to the big picture of forming the Maslow Collection because it was a major purchase from the dealer Leo Castelli and really solidified the relationship between the Maslows and Castelli. And then, of course, one of the most recognizable artists of the 20th century, if not the most, is Andy Warhol. He's represented by 11 different pieces with multiple series in the collection. And here, of course, we have the three Campbell's soup cans, onion, black bean, and pepper pot. 1968, they were printed. During his life, he was known for being very coy with journalists and others about why he made his artwork and what it was all about. But he, all along, had an idea that it was important to highlight American consumerism and materialism and celebration of celebrity, and sort of knew that these issues would become more and more important to us. In the foreground here, we have a display case of various ephemera reflecting the formation of the collection, from invitations to Lichtenstein exhibitions or Jasper Johns exhibitions, to handwritten notes from Leo Castelli to the Maslow family, staying in touch, thanking them, wishing them well. From an artist talk at Marywood University a few years ago by Melissa Mare, we have an explanation on a Poland Springs bottle of her formula to create her painting medium. They're very personal touches kept in the archives of the collection as well, of this sort. And here's the reverse side of the display case, showing early on notes on the galleries that the Maslow family wanted to visit on a given trip, a map of Soho at the time, which was the center of the art world before it became the Chelsea neighborhood. And that's where many of these dealers were located that the Maslows formed relationships with. Nancy Hoffman, Marion Goodman, John Weber, Leo Castelli, of course, which wasn't too far from the East Village, of course, and is where a lot of these artists that we're talking about lived at the time, because it was still affordable, and that's why it generated a lot of dialogue. But this is where the art market primarily was centered at the time in New York City. And then we have other correspondences between artists like Mark Cohen, the photographer, and the Maslows, wishing them well, staying in touch about exhibitions, and so forth. So it's really lovely to see kind of the personal side, which of course is always the case for any endeavor like forming a collection. It's building relationships between the collector and the artist and the dealers, and that's what we can see very clearly here. Now we're moving into the fourth and final room, which highlights artists like Peter Halley, 3 Frank Stella pieces, 2 early ones, the black monochrome and the brown, or copper I should say, and a slightly later one with the racetrack series. It's really nice to see Peter Halley next to Frank Stella, because he's simultaneously influenced by Stella and all of the work that he accomplished in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but he's also reacting against him in certain ways and updating certain concepts about minimalism and about abstraction. And Halley was or is considered an intellectual because of all of the writing and teaching that he's done, and he was instrumental in informing other artists on ideas behind abstraction. He is focused on creating geometric forms that represent social architectures, the way we live within spaces and how spaces control us, and he calls these cells or prisons. Here we have Ed Roushay, the text artist, with a fun piece called Indecision, and we have Berenice Abbott on the right with her famous photograph of the automat, which was the first version of fast food in the 1930s. Here's a general view of the minimalism, conceptualism, documentary photography room. We have Ellsworth Kelly with the orange lithograph, Sandy Skoglund, and then Mark Cohen, who's another person that the Maslows got to know very well, who's from Wilkes-Barre. That's where a lot of these photographs have been created. We have a view into the other pop art gallery of Dr. Waldeman by Roy Lichtenstein, who we've discussed. And then to the far right, we have Bernd and Hilla Becker, the conceptualist photographers from Germany, of the coal breakers. They actually photographed most of those in Pennsylvania, around the counties, throughout northeastern Pennsylvania and into Ohio in the 1970s. And their work hinges on this idea of seriality or taxonomy, and they almost treated their subjects as cultural artifacts to document before they are maybe forgotten by a large part of society. They're considered to have started the Dusseldorf school and influenced all sorts of photographers like Andreas Gursky and Jeff Wall and others. Even though Francesca and I designed the exhibition the way we did and broke it into genres, that was really just for digestibility, and because the collection is so large, it makes sense in a museum setting to break it into categories in this way. But we do have to remember that the host of influences within an artist's work are so vast and many times so unrelated to working within a genre, and highly individualized, and dealing with ideas that might not be related to or have any concern with falling into a label like Neo-Expressionism or like Conceptualism. And so we do have to remember this fact as we take in a group exhibition of this nature. So there we have it, the grand tour of Forming the Maslow Collection, a reflection on the New York City art scene of the 80s and 90s at the Everhart Museum in Scranton, PA. Hope you enjoyed it, and a thank you to the Everhart for hosting the Maslow Collection. Be well.